Okay, so I guess while we're waiting for the final people to join the meeting, we can just welcome everybody to this webinar today. And I'll just run through some of the housekeeping rules and how the Q&A and the format's going to go before I introduce you to our moderator and host for today, Donna Soleil. So yeah, this is a webinar. We're going to enable people's cameras to be turned on after the speakers. But for now, only panelists and chairs and moderators are available until the Q&A. The panel of speakers will address the audience questions after the presentation. That will happen in around 45 minutes. And to ask the question, you can use the Q&A button at the lower section of your screen. And you can direct it at a certain question. However, if you would love to speak yourself, you can enable your camera and your microphone and have a conversation as well with the speakers. Finally, we always think that after this event, it's quite nice to create a space if you'd like to stay on, meet some other people in the room, introduce yourself and have any further discussion. So if you would like to stay logged on after the 90-minute session, we'll be here. Especially my name is Jane Butler. I'm working for the Earth System Governance Project. And I'm also happy to answer questions about the project in particular. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dana Saray Jayaram, who's coordinated this event today. Dana Saray is an assistant professor at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. She is the co-coordinator for the Center of Climate Studies at Manipal Academy of Higher Education in India. Currently, she is based in Berlin as a research fellow at the Center Mark Bloch and is a guest researcher at the Freie Universität Berlin. What is exciting is that she's also the scientific steering committee member of the Earth System Governance Project, which is one of the hosting organizations today, along with the IP Circle. And we're very happy to have this event today. And I'll let Dana Saray introduce the rest of the speakers and the event as a whole. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane, for that introduction and for welcoming everyone to this webinar on climate governance in Southeast Asia. So let me just briefly introduce what ESG is all about and what Indo-Pacific Circle is about, because we have two co-hosts for this webinar, and it would be great to have a broad idea of what we do. And so let me just share my screen right now. Okay, so I hope everyone can see my slide. So the Earth System Governance, as Jane mentioned, it's one of the largest global research networks, especially consisting of social scientists who work on governance and global environmental change. So what we essentially do, we are a global research network that aims to explore political solutions and novel and more effective governance systems to cope with global environmental change. So we are over 500 and more. In fact, it's expanding further to include more researchers from across the world. We expand, of course, global mobilization of researchers in our field, particularly working on issues of climate, biodiversity, sustainability, urban solutions, and et cetera, stimulating and also facilitating research collaborations in a vibrant community. So we have a broad range of working groups, as well as task forces working on different aspects of Earth systems governance. We inform and advise at the science policy interface as well. So we don't just stick to academic research, but also we try to inform policy making and try to influence policy making in several ways. So we also have our annual conferences, Earth System Governance conferences. Like this year, we are going to have it at Radboud University in the Netherlands. Last year we had in Toronto. So we have this annual gathering of researchers working on Earth systems governance related themes as well. Now, what is interesting about our new initiative, which is the South-South initiative, under which this particular webinar is also being organized, clearly sort of aims to foster further the network of scholars based in or from the so-called Global South working in the field. So the initiative serves to increase research exchanges, address regionally relevant topics, and strengthen the network. So essentially, we are trying to also look at the Earth system governance research framework, which includes aspects of anticipation, justice, agency, architecture, and all these different topics. And how do they really speak to the realities faced by the Global South scholars? And what are the gaps that need to be filled? Are there any gaps? And what are the possibilities and limitations to researching and teaching, for instance, ESG related topics, especially from a Global South perspective? But apart from that, we are also looking at, for instance, possibilities and limitations for science policy interface or dialogues with the private sector, civil society, traditional communities, and indigenous peoples, especially when it comes to transdisciplinary and knowledge co-production as well. So we have this broad sort of agenda under which we also have already done a few initiatives. We had a session at the Toronto conference, at the Earth System Governance Conference, but also we had one webinar a couple of weeks ago. In fact, it was on Indonesia. So this is actually kind of a natural progression to sort of look at from beyond environmental governance to look at something more specific, which is climate governance in Southeast Asia in today's webinar. So the South-South initiative, we are having, of course, as I mentioned, designing regular virtual workshops and, of course, involving scholars from or based in the Global South. We are also planning to organize a South-South dialogue at the 2023 conference at Radboud University. And we also plan to call for a special issue in the Earth System Governance Journal, in fact, on Global South related topics. So if there is more interest in any of these activities, please get in touch with the International Project Office of ESG or anyone from the ESG network, really. So that is about the ESG, but as I mentioned, we have the co-host Indo-Pacific Circle. Some of you are part of the Indo-Pacific Circle, which is a curated network of early and mid-career scholars from the Indo-Pacific who are engaged in shaping the emergent kind of narratives of the region. The IPC, which is the Indo-Pacific Circle, is committed to promoting activities that encourage conversations about the Indo-Pacific region. And as a regionally owned and operated platform, IPC acts as a site for indigenous knowledge production and exchange by amplifying evidence-based narratives, creating opportunities for individual and institutional collaboration, and advocating positive regionalism and an exchange of ideas with extra-regional actors. So Indo-Pacific Circle also actually runs a journal which is called the Indo-Pacific Review, and currently it is in the process of bringing out its second issue of its journal, which is based on the theme of sustainability in the Indo-Pacific. And this issue will also feature emergent ideas about climate change, environmental dimensions of sustainability, and related governance challenges. So as you can see, we have two broad networks working on different aspects of sustainability. So it's wonderful to really bring together two big networks working on similar issues. And I'm therefore also very happy to now invite our three very eminent speakers who have been working on different aspects of sustainability in Southeast Asia. I will just briefly introduce them before inviting them to talk about their respective research themes. Dr. Helena Workey is our first speaker. She's an associate professor at the Department of International and Strategic Studies, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, University Malaya, and a visiting senior research fellow at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore. And she has published widely, including her latest book, which is The Forest for the Palms, Essays on the Politics of Haze and the Environment in Southeast Asia. She's also served as a consultant for the final review of the roadmap on ASEAN cooperation towards transboundary haze pollution control with means for implementation for ASEAN Secretariat, and as a subject area expert for environmental politics for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Malaysia between 2016 and 18. Welcome, Helena. Our second speaker, Dr. Shofan Albana Choirozad, is currently serving as an assistant professor at the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, University of Indonesia. and he is also the executive secretary of its ASEAN Study Center. Shaofan holds a PhD from the Graduate School of International Relations, Ritsumeikan University, and has been the recipient of multiple awards and grants, including the Global Challenge Research Fund, PDU-PT grant from the Ministry of Research and Higher Education, Republic of Indonesia, and the British Academy grant for International Partnership and Mobility. Welcome. And we have our third speaker, Dr. Maitreyi Mukherjee, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy with a background in biosciences and environmental management. Maitreyi's research interest lies chiefly in water-related policy research. Her prior work as a research associate at the Institute of Water Policy, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, included projects in urban water management, water pricing, and environmental sustainability in water resource development projects. So welcome to our three speakers. And as you may already know, the three speakers are going to talk about rather different topics here, which will also give us an idea of how these are linked with climate change governance in a highly climate vulnerable region like Southeast Asia, which is also a major contributor to greenhouse gases in terms of how the developmental trajectories are evolving in the region. So I would like to first invite Helena to present her research. Over to you, Helena.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And just give me a few seconds to try and present my slides properly. Please let me know if you're seeing the right thing. I think it should be correct.
That looks great.
Okay. Yep. All
This is
right.
fine.
So,
Helena.
yeah, thank you. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be the first speaker for this discussion today, and I hope I will do it justice. So I'm from Malaysia, and I'm going to be talking about a type of land or type of forest that is quite common in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia, that maybe is less well known or less talked about in other parts. And I want to talk about how, how important it is for Southeast Asia and for Southeast Asian climate, and what has been at the local and at the regional level, our attempts to try and govern this space and some of the challenges involved as well. So this is a map of Southeast Asia and also the peatlands. The dark areas that you see are the peatlands. So the peatlands in Southeast Asia are about 60% of all of the tropical peatlands in the world. And if you see the map, you will see that it's especially very common in Indonesia. So about 70% of all of Southeast Asia's peatlands are in Indonesia. But there's also some in Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, Thailand, and as well as the Philippines. So lands are extremely important for biodiversity conservation. It is a very biodiverse type of forest with lots of different flora and fauna. It's also really important for climate regulation. I will talk about it in the next slide, but it is a very important climate sink. So pristine peatlands, they do keep a lot of carbon in the ground, or rather underwater. And that makes it a very important carbon sink and a very important contributor for the carbon balance in this part of the world. It's also a natural water reservoir, and it's a source of livelihood for a lot of local communities as well. They do fishing, they catch animals for food, as well as forest resources as well. So, as I mentioned, peatlands are actually the most important land-based, it's actually the most important land-based carbon sink. So we often hear about things like oceans are a carbon sink, but we also have these really huge land-based carbon sinks, which are peatlands. So if you see in the picture here, this is trying to sort of explain how peatlands can sink or can keep carbon. If you see, the peatlands are basically usually flooded, they are wet, and when all of the debris falls into the water, they actually do not decompose. They are kept in a non-decomposed form, which means that the carbon that this debris contains are kept in their original form, and they're not escaped through the decomposition process. So the water acts as this sort of keeper of this carbon. And that is in that way it becomes a carbon sink. So this organic layer, or this carbon-rich layer, it builds up over years, very, very slowly, hundreds of thousands of years. And you can see that the peat layer can actually be very deep, few meters deep, sometimes 20, 30, and even more than that deep. So because it is extremely carbon rich or extremely organic, it is, like I said, a precious carbon sink. And however, if it is disturbed, or if the water is drained away from these areas, all of this organic material is suddenly exposed to the air, and this kickstarts the decomposition process. And this releases all the carbon that has been kept so carefully all of these many years. And this is where you have the occurrences of carbon release from peatlands. So a carbon sink, when disturbed, when drained, can actually become a big source of carbon. And this is irreversible in the sense that once the carbon is released, it cannot be captured again. Unless you want to wait for thousands of years again, which of course we don't have that kind of time. Peatlands can be restored, can be re-wetted. So that means after drainage, if you want to if you want to conserve the land, or if you want to try and replenish it, it can be re-wetted, but whatever has been gone in the meantime is gone. And basically that would have contributed to the carbon in the atmosphere. So what is the sort of additional problem that we have in Southeast Asia is haze. So because peat is very carbon intensive, it is also very fire prone. And fire, which when it happens in the peatlands, it really accelerates the carbon release in these peatlands. The organic material catches fire, and this really results in huge amounts of carbon just accelerating into the atmosphere. So natural fires in pristine peatlands are rare because, as I mentioned before, they are waterlogged. But when they are drained, when they are disturbed, they dry out very quickly, and then these fires can occur. And these fires, they can occur either accidentally due to really dry conditions or conditions of drought, maybe because of lightning, or because of somebody accidentally causing a spark, yeah, or intentionally. And intentionally, it can be a cheap and easy way to clear land for small scale or large scale agriculture. So in the past, very commonly, a lot of people thought that fires on peatlands were linked to small-scale agriculture, but now we have a better understanding of this, and we know that it's actually quite closely linked to large-scale commercial business activities as well. A lot of the type of large-scale business activities on peatlands are palm oil and pulpwood. Even though currently there is less of intentional burning through these commodities, meaning that they don't actually light the land on fire because there's so much more awareness now about haze. But the very fact that they are on peatlands, it actually increases the risk of fires there. So there is maybe what we could call an indirect impact in that sense. Yeah, the activities of large-scale commodities can drain out and can dry out the lands, which make it more vulnerable to fire. The worst fires and haze in Southeast Asian history was linked to the palm oil boom in the late 1990s, and 1997 was the worst haze in the region. And we've had recent occurrences in 2015, 2019 as well, and it has become quite regular. So now I'm going to talk a bit about why multilateral peatland governance is needed, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities, and how ASEAN as a regional organization has tried to fill this governance space. So Of course, peatlands are governed nationally at first. So you would have countries like Malaysia, like Indonesia, having their own governance systems. They have legislation. They would have agencies looking after the peatlands. So here I give you an example of Indonesia. So you can see here some of the examples of legislation that has been put into place to protect peatlands, because there is an awareness that peatlands are sensitive areas, they are important, biodiversity, and they are also very dangerous if it's not taken care of properly. And also the contribution to climate, of course. So for example, we have legislation like if it's a certain depth, you're not supposed to touch these peatlands. If the area consists of a lot of peatlands, 30% on deep peat, the concessions should not be opened up. There's also a peat moratorium that does not allow for new licenses to be given out on primary forests and peatlands. And there's also a peat restoration agency in Indonesia that is in charge of actually re-wetting and taking care of degraded peatlands. So they have, a lot of countries do have some sort of governance system in place. However, these systems are limited. So for example, there are limitations to the effectiveness. So for example, in Indonesia, there's huge demand for land. So I talked a bit about palm oil, pulp and paper. So these are booming industries right now. Indonesia, Malaysia, we are the first and second largest producers of palm oil. And land is very much in demand to open up more and more areas for concessions. So for example, for Malaysia, we do have limits on the size of land that can be opened. But for Indonesia, this is not very clear yet. And so because of this attractiveness of these areas, there is a big demand to open up not only on traditional mineral soil, but also on more marginal soils like peatlands. There's also a culture of patronage politics, which I talk a lot about in my work. The idea that, even though legislations exist, certain people who are well connected to the elites, they are able to skirt and to work around legislations and to be influential enough to be able to get permits and licenses where it may actually be restricted. So this is another issue as well. And finally, the transboundary nature of both the drivers and the effects of peatland land use change. So for example, for palm oil and for pulp and paper, some of these companies are not just Indonesian based, they are based in other countries like Malaysia or Singapore. So you do have that transboundary element there. And again, the effects as well, I talked about transboundary haze, is also transboundary. The effects go beyond Indonesia, and there will be these international pressures and cross-border diplomatic issues as well. So this is what makes peatland governance at the national level not so straightforward, which is why I would sort of connect to the necessity or to the development of sort of an ASEAN level regional governance for peatlands. So just a bit of a primer on ASEAN. It was founded in 1967 with 10 member states, and its aims is to accelerate economic growth as well as to promote regional peace in the region. And its engagement is guided by the ASEAN Way, mutual respect for the independence, sovereignty, and equality, territorial integrity of all of its member states, the right of every state to lead its existence free from interference, non-interference, settlement of differences by peaceful manner, and the avoidance of the use of force. And it's based on the 3 pillars of political security, the economy, and the socio-cultural pillar. So this is how peatland governance looks like in the ASEAN level. We have the ASEAN Peatland Management Strategy and the ASEAN Peatland Management Initiative to enhance understanding, build capacity, to reduce incidences of fire, and to support national and local implementation activities as well. We also have the ASEAN Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution, which directly refers to land and forest fires on peatlands. And also the ASEAN Social Community Blueprint, which tries to enhance policy and capacity development and best practices on peatlands. However, there are certain limitations. For example, member states are reluctant to share information about their peat areas, their strategies. There's also a limited operationalization of fire and haze assistance mechanisms. So the mechanisms are there, however, the operationalization of it is limited. And I'll be happy to talk about this more in the Q&A. And there's also generally within the ASEAN way a reluctance towards legalistic procedures, which makes it difficult to implement these frameworks. Last off, before I end, I want to also highlight some opportunities. So after COVID, we've had the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, and this involves things like promoting sustainable and responsible financing, promoting sustainability in high-value industries, and managing disaster risks. So all these areas are relevant for what's happening in the peatlands in Southeast Asia right now. There's also a big role of the public to raise awareness on the links between haze and climate change, which I think still it is quite low. There's also a need to drive consumer demand for sustainable products like palm oil and pulp and paper that is grown in a sustainable way, which includes perhaps avoiding peatlands and changing the narrative to actually be not a us versus them kind of an approach. I can talk about this more in the Q&A, but being more supportive of this framework. And finally, I would like to flag that the peatlands have a huge potential for nature-based solutions for climate, because as an important carbon sink, it is actually in a prime position to be involved in the carbon trading mechanism. And this can be used instead of using it for opening lands for commodities. But this system is still in its infancy, but I hope that this will continue on in the years to come. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Helena, for that presentation on peatland governance, which, as you said, it's not spoken about much when it comes to climate governance framework. So I'm very happy that we had this discussion, and hopefully there will be questions around a lot of things, especially what you mentioned about the operationalization of some of these frameworks and how is it working on the ground and how is it really interacting with the local communities is something that also needs to be understood more. So thank you for that presentation. And I just want to tell the audience that you can, post your questions already in the chat box. I can take them up later on when the Q&A starts. So we will have the next presentation now, Shofan. I'm sorry, Shofan, if I pronounced your name wrong. Especially your surname. So I'm really sorry for that. But yeah, okay. Yeah, so the Shofan is going to talk about, as you can see, he will be speaking about the green transition discourses in Indonesia and what can, what are the implications of this for the country. Over to you.
Yep, thank you very much. It is a great honor for me to be here, and I'll just following up from the discussion by Helena on peatland governance at regional level. Peatland governance is important because in the Indonesian context, because it is also showing this contradictions and dilemmas in the green transition issue. As we are all know, Indonesia's source of carbon emission came from the largest source of emission is coming from deforestation, and it is very much connected to the peatland governance. But apart from the deforestation, another important contributing factor is the dominance of coal in the Indonesian economy. It is in that context that I would like to start this discussion about how currently the green transition discourse had been pretty much an accepted and a dominant discourse in Indonesian policy making circles. However, there are environmental and social risks which is actually not going away with the introduction of this green transition. So it is important to then anticipate these risks. Let's move to the next slide. So this is President Joko Widodo in his last visit abroad in the Hanover Messe. Just few days ago, the president highlighted several achievements of Indonesia in the field of climate change mitigation and adaptation, including by highlighting several achievements in green transition, including one very controversial remark, but which was later clarified by the government of Indonesia, which is that there was a plan to phase out coal-powered power plant in 2025, but it was a mistake. The original plan was 2050. So, but the fact that the president himself is promoting Indonesia's achievement in this green transition, achievement in managing to slow down deforestation, in pushing renewable in the Indonesia's energy mix, etc., shows that the green energy, green transition has been a very important discourse domestically and internationally for Indonesian government. Let's move to the next slide. So the green transition has gone beyond buzzwords in civil society circles. It is already been adopted as a jargon within the Indonesian government. In Indonesia's position during its presidency in G20, for example, it put sustainable energy transition as one of the three priorities apart from the global health system and the digital transformation. And also during that period, Indonesia secured a deal, 20 billion US dollars deal for energy transition support under the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which includes the commitment from the G7 countries plus Denmark and Norway. Indonesia itself already declared its nationally determined commitments with 29% reduction of emissions without requirements, without international support, and 41% reduction of emission with international support. It also declared that Indonesia will reach net zero emission by 2060. Indonesia also joins the ADB's energy transition mechanism with Philippines and Vietnam, which aims to reduce heavy reliance on coal by retiring the CFVPs. To date, at least 9.2 gigawatt of CFVPs have been identified for early retirement under this scheme. There are also other policies, including the huge subsidies and support for electric vehicle industry development. So all of these are often framed in this language of green transition, that Indonesia is ready, Indonesia is joining the effort to do this green transition and asking for international support to fund this difficult transition. So let's move to the next slide. This is understandable if we look at the impact of climate change to Indonesia. Indonesia is very much a vulnerable country to climate change. The Global Adaptation Initiative shows that Indonesia ranks 97 with a score lower than 60. It is 47.1, showing that Indonesia is quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change due to its location. It's an archipelagic country, a lot of islands, and many of these islands are threatened with the rising level of rising sea level. There are also other effects of climate change on drought, which could also spark like fire in areas like peatlands, which is quite large in Indonesia. So a lot of different risks coming from climate change. So it is a very important issue if we look in this context. So it is understandable that green transition is something that nominally accepted in the policy discourse. However, let's move again to the next slide. Also, if we look at Indonesia, the contribution of Indonesia to the greenhouse gas emission is very much dominated by land use change and forestry. And this is what is very much connected to the peatland governance, which Helena talked in the previous presentation. But land use also very much, land use change also very much connected to not only palm oil and pulp, but also mining activities, which is also connected to the sector of electricity and heat, and as well as any other sectors. Let's move to the next slide. So in this context, coal is a very important contributor to this. Around 61% of Indonesian energy coming from coal, and thus the contribution is quite significant. And thus any efforts for green transition need to tackle this issue. First, issue of deforestation, and second, the issue of coal. Let's move to the next slide. So, what I would like to initiate a discussion here is to look at, while the government has adopted the language of green transition and commencing a lot of new regulations and policies, as we have discussed, using the language of green transition, there are symptoms that shows that we should not look at the green transition labeled initiatives without understanding the larger context. For example, one of the important initiative that is often connected to the green energy transition or green transition in the larger term is the development of nickel industry, which is very much connected to the development of electric vehicle industry in Indonesia. So the image or the Morowali in Sulawesi is the location where this mining and smelter of nickel is established, and despite the being being labeled as part of the development of the green transition, there are criticisms from different sectors of the society, including people in the region, as well as the NGOs at national and international level on the social and environmental impacts of the nickel mining, as well as the smelter in the in Morowali. And then also there are controversies surrounding the development of the hydropower dams, which is funded using the green transition scheme, which then reported to have been affected the customary communities or masyarakat tradisional, masyarakat adat in Kalimantan. There were also interesting controversies on the subsidy for electric vehicles. And there was also even a discussion to give electric stove to the public, which was cancelled after backlash from the public. If we look at the larger picture also, recently there was the controversial passing of the omnibus bill of job creation, which was uh, seen as an important bill which will simplify uh, investment for Indonesia, for foreign investment, but at the same time, it's also criticized for being dismantling a lot of environmental protection mechanisms. So this creates conflicting messages on whether Indonesia is seriously aiming for green transition or actually using green transition language to mobilize funds, which is actually not really focusing on how to support the green transition itself. But I think the picture is more complicated than that. Let's move to the next slide. We must understand the green transition as a discursive battleground. The cases that we see as symptoms, the cases of environmental and social impacts of the Morowali Industrial Park, which developed nickel for electric vehicles and labeled as part of the development of this green transition, as well as the hydropower developments in Kalimantan or the subsidies for EVs, shows that the green transition is a discursive battleground in which competing social forces attempted to define the implementation of this green transition to be aligned with their interests, which is not always necessarily aligned with the stated aim of the green transition. In this context, power relations matter, and thus it is important to approach this issue of green transition not merely at technical levels, but also by looking deeper into the complexity of the political economy at different scales of governance, from local to national to regional and international levels. So let's move to the next slide. In this context, it is important to learn from the previous big initiative related to climate change, which is implemented in Indonesia, which is the RED Plus. It was envisioned as a catalyst for transformational change towards sustainable climate mitigation in the forestry and land use sector, which is the largest contributor for emission in Indonesia. It was successful initially. The initial progress was attributed to early presidential backing and massive international support, as we see currently in the green transition or energy transition in today. But if experience are to be our teacher, one of the biggest flaw in the REDD plus implementation was that it is focusing on technicalities but not addressing social, economic, and political drivers of deforestation and forest degradation, and thus no transformational change. And the policy are very vulnerable, very susceptible to changes of political constellation at local and national levels. So, learning from this, I think there is a momentum. The fact that the Indonesian government is adopting the language of green transition at domestic and international levels and international relations, as shown by President Jokowi's speeches, it is important then to capitalize on this momentum. Let's move to the next slide. By understanding that this green transition, the just transition, is multi-level and multidimensional. We need to identify the complexity of power relations, not only between the state, between developed and developing countries, but also within the states. That the idea of green transition can be used for various purposes by different social forces which can influence the state. Thus, it is important to embed inclusive process and democratic control in the implementation of green transition policies. So there is a worrying trend of authoritarian measures, paradoxically, by using the green transition jargon, because we are trying to save the environment for the national agenda, for the national commitment. The public must sacrifice, but then the policy was actually not contributing to the green transition effectively. So it is important to ensure that the process is inclusive and democratic control is asserted to ensure that we can manage the environmental and social risks at different levels of the implementation of green transition. So I think that's from me. Hopefully, it's could spark discussion further on the issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shofan. And also to thank you for actually laying out the kind of discourses that exist on the subject, which is, I think, kind of relevant to many developing countries which are going through this whole process of transition and climate action, mitigation, adaptation, whole lot of things which countries need to prioritize at this point. We will come back to you with more questions later on. I'll now move on to Maitreyi Moiter. Over to you. She will be talking about water resources management. So slightly, probably more related to adaptation-related climate policy decision making. Yeah, over to you, Moiter. You're muted, sorry.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Thanks, Dhanashree. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm glad to join this webinar and engage with the audience today. So just to confirm, you can see my screen now, right?
Yes, yeah. Now it's fine. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Hello everyone, and good morning and good evening, whichever respectively according to your geographic location. And thanks for your time to join us for this interesting discussion. I'm Maitreyi Mukherjee. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Environment and Sustainability. We are a research center housed under the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. And today I'm going to talk about water resources management in response to climate change and what are the implications for Southeast Asia. Now, first of all, I would acknowledge that this is a really huge, big, like really expansive topic. And to talk about it, and also this is not per se my current research area. So I've tried my best to narrow down and to a single storyline where in the next slide, I will show the series of content that we will cover today. But before I start, And as this is rightly the gist of today's discussion, my discussion is on the water story, that the climate change impacts in Asia and the Southeast are essentially a water story. And the entire, whatever I'm going to say after this, is really boils down to this one single statement, which I I've quoted from an ADB Institute blog. Because water is as we will see, that water is a center point. It's a very crucial and center point to everything else that is happening: national security, food security, energy security, and overall economic growth. So this is the content for today. First, I will be talking briefly about the impacts, what's being caused by the climate change, what are the impacts, and how is it affecting uh, different countries and their economic growth. And then we will move to the broader or greater threats, how climate change and bad water policies are overall affecting other sectors as well. Then how a very brief discussion about good water governance is crucial to long-term climate resilience. Finally, I'll wrap up with the Singapore's water story, its journey from water scarcity to water security. And I'll wrap up with a few ongoing research that our institute is pursuing right now. So regarding, we are mostly aware of what climate change is doing to the planet, and there is no way I can re-emphasize how we are seeing erratic climate patterns with very, very hot summer, and every year we hear that we have hit a record high, historically high temperature in every part of the world. Rising temperature altered rainfall patterns, both in amount and timing. Receding glaciers and sea level rise. These are the major threats to water security owing to climate change. And how these are affecting immediately water resource management issues are that the hotter days means there is higher water demand. And whenever the surface water is being depleted, we are going forward we are looking into groundwater, exploiting groundwater, and that leads to receding groundwater tables. I'm not even factoring in the effects of urbanization, higher industrialization, and increased demand for food. Next, due to altered floods and droughts. First of all, there's an erratic pattern, and it is becoming unpredictable when our geographic location will be hit by a drought or a flood. As in the left side, we can see that from 1970s, 80s to just last decade till 20, in around 50 years, the incidence of natural disasters have doubled, tripled to come to at the max, like it has gone to 5 times. As you can see, the number of flood incidents for 1970s, it has multiplied 5 times or more over the last decades. And this is not unrelated. Climate science data has already established how it is related to the changing climate. Next is the receding, and not only this floods and droughts lead to reduced or excessive water supply, they also lead to huge expense in terms of property damage, public health implications, and increased pollution. Finally, receding glaciers. And we all know that these are the main water reserves for fresh water. And these are the ones that will sustain our future generations. So receding, at the present, we are most reports, as it says, that we have increased supplies due to melting glaciers. But over next 20, 30 years, these receding glaciers would mean that the surface water resources will be going down substantially. And that will also have effect on livelihoods, tourism, agriculture, and many other types of livelihoods. And finally, climate change will lead to sea level rise, specifically low-lying areas and island states are at immediate risk, and rising sea level will also mean that intrusion of seawater into land area and increase of salinity both in agricultural lands as well as fresh water. So how these water resource threats will affect other sectors. So if climate change is continued unchecked and accompanied by bad water policies, it will lead to geopolitical tensions, as we are already seeing some examples are the Mekong Delta. There is an ongoing tension between the upstream and lower stream riparian states. And there is China has already, it has been the upper stream of Mekong Delta has been excessively dammed, leading to loss of livelihoods, fishing, the availability of fishes and water for agriculture in downstreams. Similar examples exist in terms of Indus water sharing between India and Pakistan, Ganges water sharing between India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, as well as Brahmaputra between China, India, and Bangladesh. And there are several other stories, even beyond riparian sectors, that there is water sharing and political dynamics between Singapore and Malaysia as well. So from the international level, then moving on to the national and subnational level. So water security, threat to water security will mean conflicts between domestic, industrial, and agricultural water demand. With increased urbanization, increased rising population, there will be increased demand for water as well as for water from both residential, industrial, and agricultural sectors. And how these conflict is managed will also lead to, will determine how nations are managing their own water security issues internally. And obviously, these water security threats would eventually affect food security, not only locally, nationally, but also at the international level, because supply chain will be affected at every level. And finally, all these supply chain, agriculture, geopolitical tensions will affect economic growth of countries as well as regions. So how well we manage our water resources will determine our climate resilience. And one of the, although we can talk a lot about these, how we can ensure good governance in water, but just to kind of like very briefly sum it up, we have to, first of all, is promote safe access, promote access to safe water and sanitation for all. So we know that in many developing countries, still there are populations, almost one third to least 1/4 of the population still lack access to safe water and sanitation. And the immediate vulnerable section of the society are women and children. So not only it affects their public health and future, the health of future generations as well. So how to ensure inclusive water access and sanitation for all, and how to ensure gender equality in planning for water resources management is the first step. Next is how to build resilience and adaptive capacity. So generally, the trend of discussion in water governance goes on how to ensure good water supply management, demand management, how to ensure that there is a good operation, or like the infrastructure, water infrastructures are maintained properly, and there is a long-term planning. But there are several other factors that has to be factored in owing to climate change, which is how do you build in resilience and capacity even for a well-performing water system? How do you build in long-term resilience in response to or looking ahead of to the impacts of climate change? When water supply decreases and there is less rainfall or there's a flood threat, how do you safeguard your water resources? So water governance not only includes just operation, maintenance, supply side and demand side management, but also it needs to build in resilience and adaptive capacity for the long term. a very apt example here would be one of the good governance in the water sector example is Phnom Penh in Cambodia, which has, despite being in a developing country, the Phnom Penh water story is an exemplary one, because over from 1990s from being a bankrupt a water organization in early 2000, they kind of changed the entire scenario into a very competent water management system with access to water to the entire population and very low non-revenue water leakage or non-revenue water proportion. However, despite being one of the very good or best examples in Asia and the Southeast, Phnom Penh in present day, it still faces challenges in terms of how to build in long-term resilience and adaptive capacity in response to climate change, because the main river sources, the water supply is decreasing. So building resilience and adaptive capacity building is a very important component of good water governance. Next is fostering innovation in terms of technological innovations in, for example, recycling of water, desalination, and other technologies. Again, management innovation and policy innovations. So how do you manage your little supply, and within your supply, how do you manage your demand so that the demand, you can cater, your supply can cater the demand. So innovation is not only in technology, but also in management and policies. Finally, embracing environmental sustainability and circular economy. So circular economy here is use and reuse. So the cycle of the concept of water being used and reused through recycling. And finally, having us ensuring good finance sources for not only present operation, but also long-term planning and development of infrastructures in the water sector. So which can be done by ensuring good funding and a competitive tariff system. So now I will, from kind of like giving a brief overcap of impacts, threats, and good governance in scenario in Southeast Asia, I will move to one case study, which is the Singapore water story, and how the city-state moved from scarcity to water security. So now Singapore is one of the is a place where it receives maximum amount of rainfall. So literally here it rains like cats and dogs almost every day. But still, how can it be water scarce? So it's not water scarce because due to lack of rainfall, but because it has due to lack of space. Okay, so there is, despite having an average 2,500 millimeter per year of rainfall, there is not enough space to store that water. As a result, the country has to depend mostly for its water resources from imported water from Malaysia. But over since independence, over last 50 plus years, Singapore has made an incredible journey towards ensuring security, despite even if they cannot import enough water from Malaysia, how can they secure water supply and business as usual internally? So how did they do this? So first of all, it was 4 national taps. And I'll go to the next slide. So which is the 4 national taps are local catchment area, which includes almost like 2/3 of the area. So they have 17 water reservoirs now, where the rainfall is the rainwater is stored. Then they also depend on imported water, which currently is around 60% of the total daily water supply from Johor state of Malaysia. And then they have invested heavily on technology in terms of new water, which is the recycled water or water reuse. So the wastewater is not allowed to just flow into the sea. It is captured, treated, and again reintroduced in the water reservoirs for reuse here. And so that more or less comprises, at the present, it comprises around 25 to 30%. As far as I know, in next 5-10 years, the target is to reach 40% or more. And next is desalinated water. So we being an island state, we are surrounded by the sea. So in case there is less water, is just draw water from the sea and desalinate it. And that more or less comprises 25%. So the infrastructure at the present can cater to 25% of the water demand at the present. So Singapore has already developed about 5 recycling water treatment plants and 5 desalination plants in the country. Other than that, there has been a kind of like a total transformation from like water sewers to clean water networks. So when Singapore became an independent state, so it was also ridden like any other developing countries with all its water networks being almost kind of like the informal kind of sewerage from neighborhood residences. So they have kind of like stopped all of those and cleaned over the next 20-30 years. So by late 1980s, 1990s, there were already all the infrastructure for water supply and sewerage are separate. So as you can see, they have a separate storm water and sewage water collection system. So they have like a separate kind of pipe networks where the rainfall water, whatever, even the runoffs from buildings, from lawns, natural areas, all the runoffs are, there is a kind of network of canals which captures the storm water, and there is a deep tunnel sewage water collection system which captures all the wastewater and channels towards the towards recycling plants. And then they have also invested heavily in water recycling technology and desalination. And finally, they have also slowly developed a competent tariff structure, which ensures that over long run, they are financially, they're capable of running business as usual, and also according to rising demands from both residential and industrial sectors, they can increase their infrastructure and water infrastructure accordingly over next 10, 20, 30 years. So, however, but still the daily consumption is in Singapore is 150 to around 143 or 144 liters per capita per day, which they consider is still high according to global standards, and they aim over the next by 2030 to bring it down to 130 or below. So for that, they have engaged a lot in several demand management research work, which I will be discussing in my later slides. But immediately, despite having, so this is the concept of resilience. So despite having developed so far and from water scarcity to water security, in the long run, there are still several concerns. So for example, the production of new water, recycled water. So this recycled water depends on the imported water that is currently coming from Johor. So if that decreases, how can they sustain their recycling plants? On another side, Johor is also developing very fast in terms of industry development, urbanization, and new urban centers are coming up. So the water demand there is also increasing. So the water, once the water sharing treaty ends, there is always a kind of a political tug of war how the new sharing agreement will play out. So other than, even beside that, there are climate change effects, increased economic activities within Singapore, as well as rising demands, which might at both sides, both in Johor as well as Singapore, this might totally change the equation. Hence, Singapore, one of the main concern is to ensure long-term water security. And how do they do that? So this is the roadmap for, this has been launched very recently in 2021-22. They have just launched it. So they want to kind of like digitalize everything from supply side management to demand side management to manage, and so that they can also, through information awareness to the consumers, they can make the consumers more aware, more cautious about their water consumption. So from smart, so which here this slide what it shows is that, so they want to connect from the consumer water usage to the water supply side and the water consumer side through data grids and networks. So through drainage grid, smart plants, so everything. So the treatment plants, drainage grids, water grid, sewer, and the digital operation system, everything will be connected through the internet, through the data portals into one big portal, and there would be a public would have access to necessary information, so that not only their personal consumption, but also overall how the country is doing, what are the new projects coming up, what are the new programs being developed. So this is in both in terms of technology and in terms of developing a very kind of very competent public usage portal. So this is a plan that is being developed in Singapore right now. And now coming on to how our institute is developed, is involved in this journey. So for example, in our institute, one of the key centers is the Center for Water Policies. And we have been so there's a precursor of this institute was the Institute of Water Policies, and we have been doing research in this line for more than 10 years now. So we have been doing research for the water agency here for different survey as well as experimental research for demand as well as supply side management. So some of the examples, for example, is how to determine effective strategies for better or more effective efficient water saving behaviors among consumers who are using this AMI or advanced metering system. So the advanced metering system is actually the working portal of this smart PUB, this huge project, the smart PUB grid. Okay, so the through advanced metering system, how can you engage the public through different apps and game-based tools to be more aware about their water consumption? Another research is how to design policy to reduce water use. How can you moderate or modulate your tariff structure, and what is the effect on consumers and their water consumption and finally the water demand. Then again, in terms of water and food security overall, so there is one of the policy targets of Singapore is to be 30% 30% self-sufficient on food development, on food production internally by 2030. So it's the 30 by 30 goal. So Singapore will aims to produce enough food so as to cover at least 30% of its demand. So how different policies are being implemented and how it is promoting or putting barriers towards local production, and how it is being accepted by the public. So these are certain kinds of certain research that we do, and also moving forward, we will be taking these projects ahead. And with that, I come to an end. Thank you very much. I hope I have not taken too much time.
It's fine. Yeah. Thank you so much, Moiter, for giving us a very broad overview of how water and climate governance are related in Southeast Asia, and also sort of zooming into the Singapore water story, which is also very interesting to look at how a city-state manages these issues, head on. So I will now open up this platform for Q&A. I hope there are questions from the audience. I don't see anything in the Q&A, but then Q&A option. But if there are any questions, please post them. I can post them to the speakers. Or otherwise, you can just raise your hand and, I can call upon you to ask the question directly to the speakers as well. So please go ahead. So maybe I'll just start off with a couple of questions. Yeah, I can see Stefan has raised his hand. So maybe I'll allow, Stefan to first ask his question, and then I can, I have a few questions as well, which I can ask later. Stefan, over to you.
Thank you, Dhanasree, and thank you to all the presenters. These have been very interesting talks, unsurprisingly. A lot of information to digest and highly appreciated. I have one specific question that probably can best be answered by Helena with regard to the aspect of peatlands, and then maybe also a more overarching question that the whole panel can entertain as you see fit. And the question for Helena would be regarding entry points for restoration projects. Our government, the German government, has declared restoration of ecosystems a key policy priority now, but it's yeah, I mean it's challenging to really get this on the ground, and in the specific case of the peatland challenges that you have lined out, what would you see as entry points or recommendations? And then the overarching question, a lot of reference has obviously in the South East Asian context been made to the case of Indonesia. I'm still trying to get my head around whether and how the Just Energy Transition Partnership that has been announced at the latest climate conference, how does it actually make a difference? What I would appreciate your views on that. What is it already like picking up steam, or what are stumbling blocks, and how promising is it? Looking very good on paper, but meeting challenges in practice, etc. Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your feedback.
Yeah, I think Helena, you may answer, and then yeah, Shofan, maybe you can answer the Just Energy Transition Partnership afterwards. Yeah, Helena, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you, Stefan, for that question. So that is obviously something that's not too straightforward for peatlands. So I understand restoration is something that is very important to certain countries in terms of their strategies. And even for Indonesia, as well to a certain extent Malaysia, restoration has been, for example, for Indonesia, the Peatland Restoration Agency, that has been one of their key thrusts. But yeah, for tropical peatlands, at least, the science behind restoration is still in its development. So there are quite a few scientists who believe that peatlands cannot be restored effectively. So once it's gone, it's gone. So the only thing that can be done is actually to re-wet, to make it wet enough to prevent further deterioration and to prevent future fires. So that could possibly be an entry point in terms of just stabilizing the landscape. But even connection to that, there has been some organizations who have been looking into restoration in sort of a different way in terms of like what kind of seedlings, what kind of introduced species can be best strategically introduced to peatlands that have been re-wetted to sort of further stabilize the area. So I think that would be a good entry point, perhaps for research in terms of figuring out, strategies in order to best re-wet and to quicken the return to sort of a condition of the peatlands where they can start sinking carbon again, where they can start being a carbon sink rather than a carbon release in the landscape. The second one that I think has been quite a lot of projects have been involved is sort of supporting livelihoods on peatlands. So the idea being is that if you offer an alternative, or if there is an alternative use for the land, there will be less of a need or less of a push to clear the land and to change it for commodities. So this is very important. There's been lots of projects that look into how to produce less impactful paludiculture systems, agricultural systems on peatlands, and also to support the communities that are living around. So that's one of the other strategies for that. But I think one that's really exciting that I started mentioning towards the end is actually to sort of come right in the sort of along the lines of offering an alternative as well, to try and see how peatlands can be included in the carbon trading system. So there have been some very preliminary sort of pilot projects, and but I believe there's a lot of potential more here, because if the peatlands can be effectively entered into the carbon trading system, then it could be a viable source of alternative income, alternative economic system for those areas. So I think those are some of the options and entry points that investors and external parties can contribute to in the tropical peatlands of Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have lost Rafan. I don't see him. But yeah, hopefully he will return. And yeah, he will answer the other question about the JETP. If there are other questions, please raise your hand. I can see there's one in the chat box about regional consensus on climate-related issues in the Indo-Pacific region, which is something that is being spoken about a lot. I see that Shofan is back now in the meeting.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
This shows one of the problem of the green transition. My electricity just off for some minutes.
Yeah, I think I realized that when the video just froze in between. Okay, Shofan, if you can go ahead and answer the question. Yeah.
Yes. So I think the Just Energy Transition Partnership is a very important initiative. I mean, as we all know, energy transition or the larger green transition is something that is very complex and expensive. I mean, if Indonesia's economy is very much dependent on many fossil fuels, including mainly coal. A lot of provinces are very much dependent on coal and other sources of carbon emission. So I think it is very important to have international support, and that support which comes at the heart of the matter is the finance. It's financing. Financing is very much the main issue in supporting this transition. So in that sense, the large picture is good. So I think the problem with the Just Energy Transition, the challenge probably, not the problem, with this initiatives is of course how we can ensure that the implementation is effective. I mean, just as I mentioned about the previous initiative related to climate change, which is the the RADD plus, it was initially achieving significant success, but then the progress was slowing down due to the political changes at local and national levels. So the problem then is pretty much on how to ensure that we continue the momentum. Now, I think since the initiative was announced this year, the government just established the secretariat for the GETP. So I think in this February, the Indonesian government established the secretariat for the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which will be the coordinating agency on deciding the allocation of the initial GETP fund of 20 billion US dollars, which was announced last year. So I think what we need to do is to closely monitor this secretariat and the composition of this secretariat. As I mentioned, it is becoming a discursive battleground. So it is pretty much who's who in the secretariat will have a strong voice in answering your question. Is it going to be an effective instrument to support energy transition or not. It depends on how different social groups can affect the decision within that secretariat. What is interesting is that right now the secretariat is pretty much coordinated by the coordinating Ministry for Maritime and Investment Affairs, which is pretty much often linked pretty much with the economic investment. So it is important to, I think, continue to push more representation from other parts of the society, not only the private sector and the government, but also from other stakeholders which will be affected by these different initiatives. So it is important not only to include different government agencies and the private sector in the secretariat, it needs to have a representative from civil society as well. I think that will be an important step to ensure that the just energy transition can commence through this initiative effectively. Second, learning from the REDD plus, I think it is important to how to say, to embed the implementation not centralized in central government initiative. So it is important then we should, for example, provide support, and not only at the national level, in which will then decided and distributed through national mechanism, but also smaller scale initiatives at local and regional levels, especially in regions where like coal industry or forestry deforestation is occurring, like in Kalimantan, Sulawesi, or some other hotspots of potential problems. So I think by addressing that, we can mitigate and manage the risk. So overall, it is a much needed support. Finance is the crux of the matter, because the trade-off, basically green transition, just transition is an issue of managing the trade-off between development and environment, right? And the bridge to solve that dilemma is often comes in how we can recover the potential gain from development through the financing mechanisms. So I think it is a very important initiative. Again, the challenge is more on the implementation. The implementation is connected to, first, how inclusive is the process. Second is how contextualized it is in different scales of governance, because some policies at national level doesn't work with different local constellation. So it is important to then we also look at the specific local initiatives rather than only at the national level initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shofan. We are close to the end of the webinar, but I think there are more questions. Maybe if it's okay, we can extend it by 5 minutes or so. There is one question from Anisri Suresh about regional consensus on these issues within this wider Indo-Pacific region, because you have so many institutions. She has also mentioned G20, for instance. Can it be the like the kind of mechanism through which these concerns can be addressed, particularly for the global South countries? I also wanted to pose a question to Moitur about, you mentioned about policy innovation. And I was wondering, especially with, like you mentioned in the case of Singapore as well, with the kind of the climate change that we are looking at, and we are seeing how climate change is increasingly sort of testing the capacities of even well-functioning systems, like what Singapore has already put in place. I was just wondering how much of it would be more of technical or technological innovation, how much of it is more social innovation. So what kind of innovations are we looking at as we move ahead, and how will it really transform as we move ahead? So maybe Moital, you can reflect on this a bit, and Helena, maybe you can answer the question on the Indo-Pacific, because you already mentioned a little bit about the ASEAN and other regional organizations' role in this context. Yeah, Moital, go ahead.
Is it Helena or
Moital, you will speak first. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice. So yes, you are right that it is kind of like everywhere it is testing the capacity of like functioning water systems. But for example, of course, there is a lot of a role of technology is crucial. It's central, say in terms of recycling. So in recycling, it's a technology and it can be done. But how do you bring it to the people? How do you change public public perception on accepting recycled water? So there are several cases in different places of in the world. For example, in Australia, that despite having kind of allocating a lot of budget and recycling plants, but public rejected to use recycled water, or rather to reuse toilet water. So how do you kind of design your policies, design your social interventions to make public accept the reuse of water? Say, for example, here in Singapore, it has not happened in 1, 2, or even 5 years. It has been a journey of almost 10, 15 to 20 years. So this started in early 2000s. So even before they started actually to kind of even before the product, the new water came into being, they started their public awareness, public programs, and so on and so forth. And now it has become so normal, and water is recycled, and it's just kind of added to the natural reservoirs for naturalization. And a major part of it, because recycled water is it's too pure. Its major use is in the industries, in chip industries. So how this involves like how this this product, the recycled water, is kind of brought to the public and being accepted by them. I think Singapore, a lot of work has been done, and Singapore is an excellent example on this. And so that involves a lot of policy design and innovation. Okay, next is how it is challenging. Say, for example, climate change is challenging, really challenging the flood resilience infrastructure here. And there has been a lot of concern regarding sea level rise, what kind of coastal protection, hard solution or soft solutions, and how to increase how would they increase their the infrastructural resilience to heavy rain, because rainfall incidents, and at one time, like when it rains, the amount of rain has increased substantially, and we are really kind of feeling it over the last few years. And how, so there has been an active talk not only between research institutes but also the water agency. They are very slowly, they are changing their short-term and long-term goals, and not only in kind of like infrastructurally in terms of coastal protection, they have there is a lot of work going on in terms of kind of like construction and manufacturing. How do they see walls, and then also in kind of like within a perimeter having sea walls so that the water does not rise beyond a certain level? How do they protect coastal areas, and whether they would allow during kind of certain time when the sea water rises, would they allow transient flooding of close to coastal areas? And suddenly there are these beautiful beaches and coastal areas, mangrove areas also within the this little the country coastline, and suddenly if you allow transient flooding to happen, it will it would lead to a lot of public repercussion. So how would you affect how would you handle the public so that they accept these kinds of policies? So for example, just last year we did a survey survey of public perception. So how do they see the threat? What is their threat perception of climate change on flooding inland as well as coastal flooding, and whether they would be accepting how much they would be accepting temporary flooding of beaches or unused mangrove areas. So these kinds of first gaining information and then translating those information and research findings into policy design, and which will be translated into several public awareness programs and also their coastal protection design, coastal protection policies. So this is the kind of flow of or development of policy innovation. It does not happen just once in a blue moon, or suddenly it won't happen. It's a process, it's a development, and there is a lot of to and fro steps going on, right? Feedback loop, and then revision to the policy processes. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Moiter. Helena, if you can be really brief because we are over time. So yeah, if you can answer
I'll
this
try
one
to be
question.
brief. Yeah. So first of all, in terms of building regional consensus, so I think the challenge is also still at the ASEAN level. So ASEAN itself, we do have like an ASEAN working group on climate change. We do have an ASEAN climate change initiative. However, there is as yet, no real coordinated regional policy yet for climate. So each country is still kind of having their own decision-making processes. There is some effort at coordination through the initiative and the working group, but this is still limited. What I would say is that ASEAN has been quite successful in the past in moving a bit beyond ASEAN in terms of ASEAN centrality concept. So this has been quite useful in terms of traditional security issues. So I feel that this could possibly be something that ASEAN could move towards in the future. So in terms of perhaps trying to coordinate a sort of ASEAN Regional Forum for the Environment or something to that effect. So which includes perhaps an Indo-Pacific regional initiative as well. So and in terms of how multilateral institutions other beyond ASEAN can actually help or support Southeast Asia, I think this is really important because Southeast Asia, of course, is made up of developing countries, and all of these developing countries are very much committed to the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. And so I think developed country groupings can really help to support Southeast Asian countries through things like our sustainable transitions. So the understanding that Southeast Asia is going through sustainability transitions, and we have a bit of challenge in doing it at the speed and at the intensity of other countries, but at the same time, this needs support through markets, even through dialogues like what Shofwan mentioned, through discourse. This is all very important to create a supportive atmosphere so that Southeast Asia is continued to have the incentive to advance in climate security. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena. I think we can conclude the webinar with this intervention by Helena, which talks about regional cooperation, which is much needed in a region like Southeast Asia. So thank you so much to all the three speakers, Helena, Moiter, Shofwan, for giving us such a broad idea of what really climate governance looks like in Southeast Asia and what are the challenges faced by different countries. Particularly, as was mentioned, especially with Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore. There were many issues that came up, especially with regard to climate finance and also about capacities, which is very important as we move ahead in terms of what innovations can we think about in terms of dealing with climate change. About governance and policy processes, which is also very relevant as to how continuous and sustainable this can be. about climate information and the role of research institutions, which is something that came up as well. And I found that very interesting because this is what networks such as the Earth System Governance and Indo-Pacific Circle also look at science policy interface and how this can be really strengthened as the climate crisis really worsens. And what is also very interesting that came up, I think, in all the presentations was also about the inclusive agenda that we need for Southeast Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific region as well. Like the inclusive agenda is a very important node for achieving the goals that countries have set for themselves and also the global goals, including that come under the Paris Agreement itself. So thank you so much to the speakers and to the audience for your participation in this webinar. And as I mentioned, all of you are welcome for our future webinars, which will be organized by both the co-hosts, the ESG, under the South-South series, as well as other kind of webinars that the ESG organizes, and the Indo-Pacific Circle, which has also been coordinating and organizing several interesting events on these kind of issues. I will now say like a brief. I will leave it to the participants if you would like to stay and get to know more about the two networks. And if you would like to join us for future events, please stay back. Our IPO and also colleagues from the CSDR, the IPC would be happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much and have a nice day or evening wherever you're based. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll just take 1 second to, I'm so sorry. Yes, I just want to take 1 second to, on behalf of IPC and ESG, thank our speakers and thank Dr. Jairam for coordinating. She brought us in touch with them. Thank you so much. This has been a great experience. We've all learned a lot. And of course, I do look forward to speaking with the participants and if they're happy to address any questions. Thank you, Dr. Moitri. Thank you, Dr. Torazat. Thank you, Dr. Waki. Thank you, Jairam. Thank you, Emily. It was great working with you. And thank you so much. It was a great learning experience.